Round 7 of the European Team Championship in Reykjavik saw the top of the table clash between Russia and France. Russia leading by just 1 point, so this match, well, very, very important. There was only one decisive game in the four-board match, and we're going to look at it now. Alexander Grischuk from Russia had the white pieces against Laurent Fressinet, and it was everybody's favourite opening, the Spanish and the Berlin variation. And Grischuk chose to play the classic Berlin endgame, which we've seen on many occasions in these reports on this channel. And well, we saw this just the other day in the game between Michael Adams and Levon Aronian. And in that game, Aronian chose to play with his pawn on h5, which gives the knight a little bit more security on f5, but does give away the g5 square. Now, in this game today, Fressinet chose to play h6, maintaining control over g5, but it means that black is more vulnerable to this push g4. So, I mean, it changes the nature of the position, this pawn move. So, rook d1 check from Grischuk, and knight c3, and, well, this kind of thing has all been seen before. So, the knight drops back to e7, so this preempts the strike with g4, perhaps prepares to bring the bishop to f5, but also the knight may come to g6, but it's a very flexible move, knight e7. So b3, it's a fundamental choice where white develops the bishop. Sometimes it goes to f4, but on this occasion it's going to b2. So knight g6 is often played here, but Fressinet went for bishop f5, and this has been seen before. So knight d4, hitting the bishop and defending the pawn on c2, and the bishop dropped back to h7. Now, this is, of course, a very active place for the bishop, looking at that potentially vulnerable pawn on c2, and even if that pawn advances, you never know when that bishop may be able to attack the pawn chain in the case that the rooks are exchanged. But there is a downside to putting the bishop in the corner, that now black is more vulnerable to this e6 advance, as we're going to see in the game. Grischuk, after some thought, swung the knight round to the kingside to f4. Well, we saw this in the Adams-Aronian game. This is a very common manoeuvre to bring the knight perhaps to h5, perhaps to lend more support to the pawn push e6. Both sides have to be very careful how they advance their pawns in this variation. I've already mentioned, should the pawn be on h6 or h5, but one other crucial question is, should black advance with c5? In this case, it would be a mistake. That's absolutely clear, because that hits c7, and, well, if rook c8, then the a-pawn hangs. So Fressinet holds back for the moment. Rook d8. Well, eventually he wants to trade pieces. Bishop b2. Now that bishop coming to the long diagonal, and when white has a decent opportunity to play e6, then that opening the diagonal can be very useful. Well, this has all been seen before in the game between Caruana and Carlsen from Norway Chess 2015, so just a few months ago. And in that game, Carlsen played knight d5, and this knight was pushed around, and Carlsen didn't really solve all his problems in that game. He never managed to connect these two, and, well, Caruana had a very nice attack with that knight coming to f5, and this knight manoeuvre just seemed a little bit too time consuming. But Fressinet improved with a6. So, of course, that's to cover the b5 square, and only then did he advance with c5, driving that knight away, and then he very quickly afterwards stationed the knight to c6. So it seems that black has found a bit of a footing in the centre. Maybe later that knight can hop to either b4 or d4. But there is a downside to pushing with c5, and that is that the d5 square is weakened. So, for example, after bishop e7, knight d5, and the knight hits c7, that can be defended, but there's also this possibility to play e6 as well, opening up the bishop's diagonal, and black is under a lot of pressure there. Remember that the king has already moved. The king cannot castle, which makes life rather difficult for black. Well, Fressinet played bishop c2, and that forced white to do something about the rooks. So, after a very long think, Grischuk exchanged rooks. Now, if black has the chance to find footing with knight e6 to blockade that pawn, then that will stymie the bishop on b2 and to some extent the knight on f3. And black, I think, would probably be doing okay there. So Grischuk, after not too long, pushed with e6. It's an excellent move. And, in the Berlin, black always needs to be ready to meet this move. But in this case, it's really not easy. If that's taken with the knight, then rook e1. White is going to recover this pawn. Then you can see the bishop has influence over the king side, and the knight might hop into e5. Certainly white is better there. And it means that sometimes white can turn his attention to the queen side as well to attack this pawn. And likewise, f takes, rook e1, white has tremendous play here. So Fressinet, after quite a big think, played f6. That keeps this bishop locked out, but of course means that white has this potentially, very far advanced passed pawn. But can white connect with that pawn? That's the thing. It could be that black can somehow encircle that pawn and win it. And I think this is what Grischuk spent a lot of his time calculating before he played e6. Is this actually safe for white? So rook c1, knocking the bishop back, and then rook e1. So the pawn is covered by rook and knight. Bishop came out to d6, and now here's an important move. Knight h4. So obviously bishop takes knight, we've met my knight takes bishop, everything under control for white. So bishop moved away. Knight h5. I think it's quite clear that white is starting to take control here. It's very difficult for black to quell white's initiative. The pawns are inflexible because any movement, they'll just be killed, and this is highly unpleasant for black. Fressinet felt the need to play rook h7, and that's pretty miserable. That's tempting to take that and go for this endgame. That would be a huge mistake. In fact, in this case, black finds his feet and can take here, and he's doing all right. But after very little time, Grischuk advanced the pawn, and just this straight pawn advance gives white a massive advantage. Look at that pawn chain now. This is a winning position for white. There's no doubt about it. But Grischuk had used so much time in getting to this position. Could he finish it off running so short of time? And Fressinet, he's a very good blitz player, a very good speed player, and he knows how to complicate the position. But Grischuk still kind of in control here. Now, he exchanged here, and the reason for that is that he wants to bring his rook into the game. If that rook breaks through into black's position, then it could be all over. But things aren't so simple. Let's have a look what happened. b6. Now, knight g6. That means, look at the rook. It's absolutely miserable. It looks completely hopeless, but Fressinet somehow managed to keep the position complicated. Rook d3. Well, could be all over if white manages to successfully get rid of this knight, but it's a tricky situation. Obviously, if that pawn is taken, then, for example, there's a pin here. Even this could well be winning for white if this is simply protected. But there are various ways black can try and complicate that. So Grischuk, as I said, short of time, very sensibly just built up first before committing himself. And in fact, there is no need to rush this. Bishop c2 played. Now I think it might be an option just to take this off and to give the exchange. But Grischuk played rook a3, and it looks completely winning to bring the rook down, but he'd overlooked knight takes pawn. Very tricky stuff, but luck was on Grischuk's side, because even after this little tactic, in fact, white maintains an absolutely crushing position. So Fressinet has got rid of one of these pawns on the king side, but his rook remains completely shut in, and that pass pawn on e6 is still very powerful. In fact, black is just lost here. The king is just too far away, and black simply can't break free here. f5. But Grischuk's technique was good. He still hadn't reached the time control at move 40, but he's getting there. 2 moves to go, and a couple of very easy moves. And this was a nice move to play on his 40th move. There are various things that white could play here, but instead of rushing in, Grischuk just closed things down with a4 and didn't commit himself. So those 2 pawns prevent black finding any counterplay on the queen side with b5, and actually Grischuk's play was excellent. Fressinet can do very little, do really nothing at all, and there are various ways to win this position. One way is to actually give up this pawn and to bring the king in. King takes pawn, and then to win this rook. But Grischuk found another way, which was also very, very simple. Bishop f6. Now this doesn't let the rook out, because you can see all these squares are covered by white's pieces. And he simply prepared rook g7, which forces an exchange of rooks. If the rooks are exchanged here, then the h-pawn drops, and that's fatal. Fressinet played rook h8, but that also allowed an exchange of rooks. In this position, he actually resigned, because if king takes, then bishop takes, and this bishop endgame is totally winning for white. For example, if king d8, well, let's take the h-pawn and just come back here. Once the bishop moves, obviously the king pawn endgame is completely winning with an outside pawn, but if the bishop moves, then the bishop comes down to c7 and takes that pawn. Or, going back to this position, if bishop f8, then the king just comes in and takes the pawn. So in the end, Grischuk won very smoothly, not completely by design, but in fact it was an excellent game. So that victory meant that Russia won the match 2.5, 1.5, and after 7 rounds Russia lead with 13 points, and then there are 5 teams on 10 points. So Russia have a 3-point lead with only 2 rounds to go. They could wrap it all up tomorrow. Tomorrow they play Armenia, so it's not over yet. But Russia looking very good.